Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you in Jakarta to discuss the post-2015 development agenda and the potential importance of the Urban SDG in that. I'm Aromar Revi, Director of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements and also co-chair of the SDSN Thematic Group on Sustainable Cities. Been very active over the last year and a half in trying to work with colleagues across the world to pull together this campaign for an Urban SDG, which seems like it's about to happen. So I guess the key question is, why does the world need an urban SDG? If you start about 100 years ago, the world in 1900, the population was about 1.5 billion, of which about 13% was urban. The gross world product was about 2 trillion, of which 30% was in urban areas. And then of course, if you jump maybe 50 years to the post-war era, you find the population growing to about 2.5 billion, the urban share going to 29%, the gross world product going up to about 7 trillion, and 45% of that is in urban areas. But you see a significant expansion of urbanization, especially in Latin America, North America, and in Asia. And I think this is very important to understand. The fact that Asia becomes, in some senses, the epicenter of the urban expansion, the urban explosion in some parts, especially East Asia, over the next 50 years. And then, of course, if you jump to very close to the present, that's 2013, you can see the world from space, you can see the location of urban centers, and you see Asia is absolutely central to the urban transformation that the world is experiencing. Global population touches 7 billion, the urban share crosses 50%. But the most interesting thing is gross world product touching about 70 billion, and about 70% of that, which means about 50 trillion actually coming from urban areas. So while we often speak of the world being an urban planet now, from the mid-2000s, going to more than 50%, the really important thing for us to understand is somewhere from the mid-1980s, the globe has actually been significantly urban in terms of the economy. So that's where the jobs are being created, that is where the incremental growth is actually taking place, and that is why Asia, especially East and Southeast Asia, and Indonesia in particular, are very important and are going to be increasingly important over the next 2 decades, the period in which the SDGs will actually be implemented. So if you look at the world in 2025, this is a projection, look at the spread of cities across the world, and you can see East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia as being almost covered in some senses by a process of rapid urbanization, growth happening in West Africa, Southern Africa, some parts of Latin America, and of course growing in other places. You can see here the importance of cities in the urban economy, and of course, as we know, 2/3 of the global economy is now being driven by emerging markets, and of course the emerging markets are very strongly driven by Asian leaders, including countries that are in the room today. So in summary there, urbanization is not just a megatrend, it's a gigatrend. It's a millennium transformation of human culture, society, the economy, polity, and of course planetary systems. So the interesting thing about the SDGs is that they go beyond the MDGs, which were focused on poor people in poor countries. They focus on everybody everywhere, and they focus on all dimensions of development, the end of extreme poverty, dealing with employment, dealing with water, dealing with energy, dealing with waste, etc. The question, of course, is, can we use cities as an integrating element in this process? So I guess one of the reasons that we feel that the SDGs or the urban SDG is very important is because, number one, urbanization is now a global process, and of course a sustainable planet depends on how cities grow, function, and respond to stress. So like the UN Secretary General has said, the battle for sustainable development is going to be won and fought in our cities. I would go further and say that the battle for sustainable development is going to actually be fought for the next 15 or 20 years and won in the cities of Asia. And that's why this meeting that you're running is so critically important. This needs to be led by citizens and leaders of urban areas, and who need to be empowered. For that empowerment, you do need an SDG. The SDG, in some senses, would help motivate public-private partnerships for measurable implementation. The contra, of course, is that if urban issues are mainstreamed, as some people suggest they should be, the role of cities will actually disappear. And as an organizing force, and we've seen as a force for change and for good, most recently at the Climate Summit, where the Urban Climate Compact was laid out, cities and mayors are going to be very important in making this change. And of course, the Urban SDG would promote and strengthen other SDGs, whether it's health or education or healthcare, or of course the questions of employment and poverty, in which cities are going to play a very important role. There are some counterfactuals. The reason why a whole range of countries and experts have said that it may not be such a good idea to have an urban SDG. The first one, of course, is what I call the rural-urban dichotomy, and that is, if you have to have an urban goal, you have to have a rural goal. If you have both goals, it adds too many goals. This is, I think, a false dichotomy. We actually see them as complementary. The second question, of course, is that there are too many goals, and if you have an urban goal, that adds to the complexity of things. To our mind, urbanization and an urban goal actually provides us a very simple and effective way to aid implementation, to make sure that something will actually happen on the ground. There's also a strong emphasis on infrastructure. Cities and infrastructure are very closely tied to each other, so there's an opportunity to integrate sustainable infrastructure development into sustainable urban development. And then, of course, a lot of people are challenged by the idea that the localization of the SDG means that having a universal goal at global or national level will be contested by having a focus on local questions. And I think what we've demonstrated quite clearly over the last year and a half is that you can have a set of goals that are universal, but in the framework of targets and indicators and the choices that you make, you can actually accommodate and address local opportunities and challenges, especially because cities are very different. They're very diverse. Even within one country and region, they're diverse. We need to be able to accommodate that. That's what's going to give us the opportunity for innovation to actually play itself out. So in some senses, the standalone urban sustainable development goal is a 21st century idea whose time has come. And we worked quite carefully over the last year to frame a set of 10 goals. This is the SDSN proposal for 10 SDGs from the middle of 2013. And what you might notice here is 2 that I've highlighted in red. So in some senses, we believe that you cannot have inclusive, productive and resilient cities unless you have sustainable agriculture and you have rural prosperity. So rural and urban development are linked to each other, and especially for most of the countries of Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, keeping the balance between the two is very important. So you need to see them as complementary. They are not actually competitive. Unfortunately, some of the debate has sort of lost that nuance, and I think we need to bring that back. In order to make this happen, starting in September 2013, we brought together over 200 cities, regional governments, international organizations, people movement and universities to support a standalone urban sustainable development goal. We brought together UN Habitat, UCLG, Cities Alliance, ICLEI, C40, the World Urban Campaign, Metropolis, 170 cities and regional governments, and of course some of the leading support organizations, research organizations and universities across the world. So I guess the key question we are asking here is, why use a 19th century set of ideas and institutional frames which we use in conventional development to address the 21st century challenge? Why don't we take the tremendous opportunity that cities provide us and use that as an integrating principle? So the original articulation of the urban SDG, which is sort of crisp and worked out through the entire campaign, is quite simple. It is to make all cities socially inclusive, economically productive, environmentally sustainable, secure and resilient to climate change and other risks. And of course, to make that possible, develop participatory, accountable and effective city governance to support rapid and equitable urban transformation. That was the original framing. And to be able to support that, 3 core targets: 1, to end poverty, expand employment and productivity, raise living standards, especially in slums; another one, to enable universal access to basic services and housing; and the third, to deal with the whole range of environmental questions, efficient land use and resource use, etc. These proposed targets were actually tested in a process of developing urban indicators for half a dozen cities across the world, and I would encourage people in this room to critique them and look at how they would apply them to cities in Southeast Asia, Jakarta, Bangkok, and of course we have colleagues from China who've done this in dramatic ways across many Chinese cities. And of course there was a tremendous amount of debate over many months, and that led after almost a process of a year plus to a set of 13 sustainable development goals that came out of the open working group. We were positively surprised to see goal 11, which is very close to the articulation that the campaign put together, and it reads very simply as: make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. This is very close to what we wanted, but of course it's within a frame in which there are 17 goals, so there are a whole range of questions of how this will proceed further, and I hope by early December, as the Secretary General's report emerges, as the process moving up to the UN General Assembly in 2015 is laid out, we will understand how this process will proceed with countries across the world. So what we have then as goal 11 is, as I said, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe and resilient. There are a number of targets. The first one is to deal with adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services and accreditation of slums. The second is basically looking at sustainable transportation and access. The third essentially looks at capacities for participatory, integrated and sustainable human settlements planning and management. The fourth focuses on natural and built heritage. The fifth focuses on risk and reducing the number of deaths and people affected by disasters. The sixth focuses on the environmental impact of cities, on air, waste and municipal management. And the seventh basically focuses on safety and inclusive accessible access to green and public spaces. So that's the framing. Changed a little bit over the course of the year. There is some discussion on how they may be tighten the language and sort of play itself out. And then a whole range of questions about implementation. So given that, there's been a fair debate within the international community, within urbanists across the world, of what may be missing in this. And I think this is something that may be very useful to debate, because not only are the SDGs important, but the transition to the Habitat 3 agenda, the new urban agenda, is important. To my mind at least, and this is a personal view here, what are we missing in this articulation? The first thing, at least this is my own personal sort of analysis of this, is that there may be too many goals. 17 is probably too much, and because of that there are too many targets and indicators, and to focus on and act on them, whether it's at national level or with regional governments or even at city level, may be an overload, because you need to make this operational, and having too many goals and targets makes it complex. The second thing is rural prosperity and rural development seem to have disappeared from the agenda. I think that's very important, especially for Asia. The balance, as I said earlier, between urban and rural areas, the integration of the opportunities is very critical. The linkage between cities' productivity, employment and poverty reduction seems to have been lost in the translation here, and that needs to be brought back, because cities are key drivers of this, especially for Asia. It is the productivity of cities that enable us to be able to address the question of poverty in a sustainable manner, both in urban and rural areas. Infrastructure seems to be tied only to industrialization, but of course we know that there's village infrastructure, there's agriculture and services, and not all cities are industrial. Some are trading cities, some are cities that actually focus on services. So there may be a misunderstanding that infrastructure and sort of industrialization come together. I think we need to look at that differently. And of course, the implementation architecture is overlapping and confused. That needs to be sorted. Otherwise, as many of us who are actually implementing and managing these processes, it may be very difficult to try and make this happen, because the challenge for us is not to talk about sustainability. The challenge is to be able to implement it and to address in a significant way these goals in the next 15 or 20 years. And of course, how much resources and what means of financing are needed are somewhat unclear. There's a relatively weak emphasis on the legal, regulatory and institutional capacity, which in many cases, especially in our parts of the world, become a serious impediment to actual delivery or implementation. And then, to my mind at least, there's a limited dialogue with the primary agents of change, and that is people like yourselves in the room, people who actually manage urban systems, people who are sort of managing the functioning of regions and processes in countries. That dialogue is very important, and it's a complex dialogue, and in some cases I guess it's politically somewhat sensitive. So at the end, what I would say is an urban SDG is important because it is inspirational, it is aspirational for large numbers of people, and it is something that can be done, it can be operationalized. It brings together multiple sectors, actors and processes in new ways that focus on the synergy between the opportunities that will help us overcome the many systemic and structural challenges that we face in development across the world. And I think the East Asian example is probably the most interesting one. We have in a generation or so dramatically altered the global landscape in terms of poverty, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of basic services. Now, not everything can be done in the same way, because each country is different, each city is different, but that I think is a great inspiration for us of trying to bring together these processes. I mean, we all agree that this will not be easy. It will require a reimagined institutional and financial architecture, a new set of processes and metrics. Of course, it needs to be more equitable, politically and economically viable, and cheaper and more efficient than the unstructured sort of process at the moment of managing and handling stuff as business as usual. The critical thing in this is the commitment of member states, of regional and city governments, communities and enterprises to make this possible, because we believe that cities will provide us the way of critically and very rapidly making the SDGs and of course the new urban agenda something that will become parts of the lives of all of us in the next 15 or 20 years' time. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a very good meeting.